I stumbled upon an article while I was searching for something the other day. It had a title so irresistible that I dropped everything I was doing to read it. It was titled, "Okay Kids, This Boomer Has Had Enough." It's an opinion article written by one Tyler Cowen, a professor of economics at George Mason University, and it's the most frustrating article I've ever read. The article itself was on Bloomberg. I'll link it down below. Now, for some information about myself as well as some background on the topic. I'm 19 years old. I frequently browse Twitter, and recently, as I'm sure you know since you clicked on the video, the internet seems to have become a battleground between older generations, primarily baby boomers, and younger generations, like millennials and Gen Z. Now, I think it's pretty much common knowledge that newer generations will almost universally rebel against older generations. It happened with Generation X in the form of music and drug use, and it's happening now with millennials and Generation Z in the form of memes. That might sound dumb, but OK Boomer, and the boomer as a stereotypical caricature of an entire generation, has taken off more recently. And apparently, that's upsetting some of the more technologically literate members of the boomer tribe. Tyler Cowen, who I'll just refer to as Tyler for the rest of the video, begins his article with, "As a baby boomer myself, I have mixed feelings about the latest linguistic weapon of generational warfare being deployed against us. Am I okay with OK Boomer, the flippant yet passive retort from millennials or members of Generation Z whenever anyone of my generation decries the dangers of e-scooters or overreactions to climate change?" So, the way he phrases this is clearly in opposition to the use of the phrase, which shows that it does, in fact, upset him, at least a little. So good job, guys. Keep it up. Also, him describing the phrase as passive and his later justification for doing so tells me that he misses the point of the phrase so outlandishly, it's baffling. I'll get to that later. And finally, he and his generation decry the dangers of scooters, linking an equally ridiculous article about how e-scooters are somehow bad and we should just go back to using cars. And quote-unquote overreactions to climate change, which, by the way, his own university recognizes as such a problem that they have dedicated a program for raising awareness to it. Link in the description. He continues with, "I realize that whether I'm okay isn't really the question. Still, I would characterize my reaction as irritated, put off, and maybe a little bit flattered. Irritated and put off, I definitely understand, as that's the intent of the phrase. However, this next paragraph is so indescribably odd to me that I had to read it multiple times just to understand the mental gymnastics going on within it. He says, on the positive side, my generation is being treated as a force of nature, a generation so strong and influential that it must be addressed by name. In so many debates today, being insulted is seen as a mark of importance. For what it is worth, I don't go around talking about millennials or Generation X or Generation Z very much. This column accepted, I suppose. Furthermore, as an economist, I see the word boom as having a generally positive connotation. I will say this. The baby boomer generation was, and in some respects still is, a force of nature. After all, there are more active voting baby boomers than any other generation according to the Pew Research Center. And even before millennials began to vote in the late 90s, Tyler's generation had already elected administrations that made their lives, and mine, a hell of a lot harder. Like in 1979, when the inflation rate of the US dollar hit an astounding 11%, or the year after that, when it grew to 13.5%, or the year after that, when it went back down to only 10% per year. All that, according to inflationdata.com, a website that happens to have been featured in Bloomberg before. As an economist, Tyler, I think you must agree that those numbers are more than a little bit troubling. After all, you and I, and millions of people in my generation now feeling the impacts of the collapse of the US dollar, know that a nickel doesn't exactly buy you a candy bar anymore. So yes, I'd say boomers are a force of nature. Well, I'd probably actually call them a force against nature, seeing as they are the main deniers of climate change, and are not exactly trying their best to preserve nature, but I digress. He also says that being insulted is a mark of importance in a debate. I did debate in high school, and while that's not exactly the best measurement of a real-life debate, I would say that an ad hominem attack is, in fact, a surefire way to lose a debate in the mind of your opponent. But not necessarily to a spectator. After all, I seem to recall one Donald J. Trump attacking Lion Ted and Crooked Hillary all the way into office. Trump, by the way, carried the boomer vote, that is ages 50 to 65, by 51%, beating Hillary out by 6%, a wide margin of victory in such a close election by all other standards. That data, once again, supplied by Pew Research Center. So, Being insulted is, at least to your generation, Tyler, not a mark of importance. It's a mark of shame and loss. And while Tyler may not personally use the terms millennial or Gen Z very much, his generation certainly seems to. As a matter of fact, there are people who make a living drawing insulting and otherwise belittling comics about those damn millennials. For this, I simply refer to one of my personal favorite subreddits, r/boomershumor. Tons and tons of comics about millennials and Gen Z kids fill the subreddit, most of which are taken from Facebook, of course. And, just a side note, why are so many of them just overtly sexual and sexist? I don't understand what exactly it is that's so funny about hating your wife and wanting to ruin your marriage by committing adultery. Not only that, but the existence of the phrase, "okay boomer," is almost a direct response to older generations' hypocritical and outright idiotic criticism of things that younger generations do, like using smartphones, one of the single most important and nearly universal inventions in human history. I highly doubt Tyler still has a flip phone, after all. And finally, to wrap up this enigma of a paragraph, he says that, as an economist, the word boom has a generally positive connotation, which I understand, but baby boomer, as a label describing an age group, has nothing inherently to do with economics, and the word boom isn't necessarily good outside of economics. For example, if I'm on LiveLeak and I point to the screen and say, "that guy went boom," you're probably not going to think that that's a good thing. He continues his article not by explaining why he's offended, irritated, or otherwise put off by the phrase "okay boomer," but instead by claiming that the use of the phrase is impotent. On the negative side, I worry that those who deploy "okay boomer" are putting themselves down and signaling their own impotence. I am not arguing for expletive deleted boomer, which I can only assume is fuck boomer or fuck boomers, even though it would have a vitality and rebellious spirit very much reminiscent of the 1960s or 1970s, which of course were quintessential boomer eras. But when I read or hear "okay boomer," I start to think that there might be something special about baby boomers after all. We boomers may not be different in kind from other generations, but we do seem to inspire rhetorical creativity in our critics. This is where I began to understand that Tyler doesn't exactly get what "okay boomer" really means. He sees it at face value, choosing not to think for even a single second why this specific phrase resonates so well with younger generations. And, by the way, another side note, of course we're creative with our criticism. That type of thing skips a generation, and seeing as how boomers have recycled the same "phones are bad" joke over and over again for the past 30 years, I think it's safe to say creativity got skipped to us. Tyler continues with, "the closest earlier analog to "okay boomer" is probably "okay chief," a slightly sardonic response to a bossy or persistent request. So the phrase "okay boomer" is itself an implicit and indeed somewhat passive admission as to who is really in charge. Members of Generation Z are subtly demonstrating the cliches about them may have a grain of truth. This might be the worst misinterpretation of a phrase I have personally ever seen. For one, the phrase "okay chief," as it's given to us by Tyler, is not even close to an analog for "okay boomer." Where "okay chief" is response and resignation to the task at hand, albeit unwilling, "okay boomer" is a complete dismissal of what is being asked. The closest analog for "okay boomer" is an eye roll and a swift disregard for anything that person just said. "Okay boomer" is not a passive admission of who's really in charge. It's the equivalent of ignoring a lunatic you pass on the street. Because, often enough, that's what your generation sounds like to us, Tyler. Lunatics. "Okay boomer" resonates so fully with younger generations because older generations made it resonate. The bossy and persistent request here isn't a request at all. It's a pestering of and a disregard for the existence of issues that affect millennials and Gen Z kids like me on a daily basis. Things like climate change, rising tuition costs leading to life-crippling student debt, and the systematic violation of LGBT and minority rights, not only at the national level, but more importantly, the local level. "Okay boomer" is a phrase designed not to attack or refute like fuck boomers would be, but to completely ignore and disregard anything your generation says, because that's what you've been doing to us for our entire lives. Tyler continues this train wreck with, "As I said, I'm a baby boomer, born in 1962, and I do a lot of public speaking about such topics as the absence of free lunches in this world. Yet, I have never heard anyone say 'okay boomer' back to me. Instead, I see the phrase on social media, another sign of the essentially passive nature of the response, and wearing an "okay boomer" hoodie or buying other such merchandise doesn't seem like a major sign of rebellion either. If there is any native medium for the "okay boomer" meme, in fact, it is short TikTok videos, one of the more evanescent forms of social media. That the site seems plagued by Chinese censorship is just another state of affairs that boomers find more offensive than does Generation Z. Tyler, I'm not sure if you knew this, but unless you've given those speeches within the past month to an audience of 15 to 25-year-olds, you're not going to hear "Okay, Boomer." Now, on the internet, where 15 to 25-year-olds are the vast majority of users, you're going to hear it a lot. I don't see how that signals a passive nature, at all. It's a lot easier to call someone a boomer if you, actually see them, and have the ability to call them that. Also, your point about merchandise is outright ridiculous. One, as an economist, you surely understand that the demand for that particular product is pretty damn high right now, and when there's demand, someone somewhere is going to supply. Saying that purchasing something isn't an act of rebellion makes zero sense if thought about for longer than 10 seconds. Rebellious music sales, tattoos, piercings, drugs, and offensive posters, books, movies, etc. have always been a driving force in rebellious culture. All of those things are bought. With money. Some of them were even worn. I don't think the group being rebelled against gets to dictate exactly what is or isn't rebellious. That kind of defeats the purpose. Then he talks for a second about TikTok, which is owned by a Chinese corporation, and makes a half-hearted jab at those darn TikTokers for agreeing with Chinese censorship. For one, I seriously doubt Tyler spent more than 10 seconds on TikTok if he did at all. Also, Tyler clearly doesn't play video games, nor does he watch very many Twitch streams, nor does he go on Reddit or 4chan or literally any other social media site, because if he did, he'd see the massive backlash against Blizzard for supporting Chinese censorship of the Hong Kong issue, which, right now, seems to be championed by millennials much more than baby boomers. The idea that someone using a website, regardless of who it's owned by, means they support 100% of the issues that the company that owns the website supports, shows a clear misunderstanding of the internet in general. For example, YouTube, the platform I'm using right now, censors and claims the revenue from hundreds of channels I enjoy watching. Will I stop using YouTube because I don't support those policies? No, because I enjoy those channels and want to support them, regardless of where the videos are hosted. The last 3 paragraphs of the article are all about the same thing, so I'll tackle them all at once, and buckle in, this is going to be a long one. They read as follows. My biggest worry about OK Boomer is the generational stereotyping it embodies. It wouldn't be acceptable to baldly criticize older people simply for being old, so why is it okay to use a circumlocution that does the same thing? You old fogies don't have a clue is perhaps a more direct translation of the phrase, and I'm not sure that the ostensibly greater politeness of OK Boomer is a virtue. Would we think much of any boomer wearing a t-shirt proclaiming, "Not impressed kid, sure kiddo," or "Nice try kid"? I'm greatly pleased that the post-boomer generations are, by all appearances, less racist and sexist than their predecessors. Still, prejudices are a part of human nature. There is always a danger that they will re-emerge, redirected at other targets, defined by their age, their political views, their wealth, the size of their carbon footprint, or some other salient variable. Prejudice doesn't become acceptable simply because it is not directed at someone's race, ethnicity, or gender. I don't wish to use this column to proclaim myself or to ask for anyone else's okay, sarcastically or otherwise. I'll simply note in closing that the growing age segregation of American society is a great tragedy and a foregone opportunity. If younger generations are looking for yet another good cause, that would be a very good one to embrace. Oh boy, where to begin? First off, the entire first paragraph is, self-defeating. It operates on a very clear double standard. To Tyler, it seems, generational stereotyping is either non-existent for young people or just isn't a problem, which, I've already pointed out numerous times, is false. The fact that nobody would really care if old people wore dumb shirts making fun of kids, which they do, by the way, is the problem. And the reason that it's so funny to repeat OK Boomer to someone is because they clearly don't see that this is oh so obvious a double standard. For the next paragraph, I will say that I appreciate his acknowledgement that younger generations are less prejudiced. It shows that he's at least capable of seeing the ridiculousness of some people in his generation. But his next statements are odd to me. His argument is that, since human beings are inherently prejudiced, if racism and sexism go down, things like ageism must replace them, or at least could. And I will say that ageism could replace them, but simply because one prejudice disappears, another one does not have to take its place. Prejudice isn't some awful game of whack-a-mole where if you're not calling someone the N-word, you have to call a woman a bitch. In fact, you can just not be an asshole. It's pretty easy, actually. And while I will say that OK Boomer may be a little bit more than just ageist, it isn't anything that we haven't already experienced before. And if us soft millennials can handle it, I'm sure you can too, Tyler. Also, the targets you present other than age are all things that are directly controllable by the individual in question. Unlike age, race, ethnicity, gender identity, or sexual orientation, carbon footprint is one of the single easiest things to control on Earth. And the idea that I can't be mad at someone for not at least trying to reduce it to, save the human race is insulting. Why can't I be angry that Jeff Bezos has $113 billion and is the human equivalent of a fantasy dragon hoarding gold while the serfs starve in the village nearby? Millions of people have starved to death due to a lack of money or frozen to death because they couldn't afford a house in the United States. And I'm supposed to just agree when your generation votes yet another candidate who hates minorities and a vice president who wants to shock the gay away? I seem to recall a large tea party thrown outside the White House when the first black president was elected, complete with lynched effigies and burning crosses. I was 8 years old when I saw all that on the news. So, you're damn right I'm going to be prejudiced against those people. Respect is earned, and those groups haven't exactly done a great job of earning it from me. So, in summation of the entire article... Okay, Boomer. Okay, Boomer. Okay, Boomer. Okay, Boomer.